The loudest man in the room is rarely the strongest, someone said with a laugh. And today we are about to prove it. The joke echoed across the polished training hall inside Sterling Dynamics headquarters, drawing confident smiles from nearly every applicant waiting beneath bright white lights. More than 30 candidates had traveled from across the country for the opportunity of a lifetime. The position offered an extraordinary salary, unmatched benefits, and the privilege of protecting one of America's most influential technology leaders. Former police officers stood beside private security professionals. Decorated veterans adjusted expensive tactical jackets, while fitness champions stretched confidently near the training mats. Every conversation sounded like a competition before the evaluations had even begun. Then the glass entrance doors quietly opened. A 42-year-old single father stepped inside wearing a faded work jacket, worn blue jeans, and clean work boots that had clearly seen years of honest labor. Resting on one shoulder was a weathered backpack. Walking beside him was his 9-year-old daughter, Lily, carrying a library book almost as large as her small hands. She looked around the enormous lobby with quiet curiosity, while her father simply smiled at the receptionist. "Good morning," Ethan Walker said politely. "I believe I am here for the executive protection interview." The receptionist welcomed him kindly before printing his visitor badge. Behind him, several applicants exchanged amused glances. One man folded his arms and whispered loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Did somebody accidentally invite the maintenance crew?" A second applicant laughed. "Maybe he is here to repair the training equipment after we finish." More laughter rolled through the room. Ethan showed no sign of embarrassment. Instead, he knelt beside Lily and gently adjusted the strap of her backpack. "You remember our deal?" he asked softly. Lily nodded with a bright smile. "I stay patient, read my book, and cheer quietly." Ethan smiled back. "Exactly right." She walked toward a comfortable chair near the reception area, opened her novel, and disappeared into its pages without another word. Above the training floor, behind floor-to-ceiling observation glass, Victoria Sterling watched the arrivals with calm attention. At 34 years old, she had built a reputation as one of the most disciplined chief executive officers in the country. She rarely judged people emotionally, yet the contrast before her was impossible to ignore. Every applicant downstairs looked prepared for the role. Only one looked like he had arrived straight from a maintenance shift. Her chief operations officer, Daniel Brooks, handed her another applicant file before pausing at Ethan's. "Interesting," Daniel murmured. "Current occupation, commercial maintenance technician. Widower. One daughter. Excellent work references. Very little else." Victoria studied the file a moment longer. "Military history." Daniel frowned at his tablet. "Nothing public. If there is more, it is not showing." Down below, the lead instructor, Marcus Hale, stepped confidently onto the training floor. His voice carried easily across the silent room. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Today is not about muscles or impressive resumes. Executive protection is about judgment, awareness, discipline, and character." Several applicants nodded confidently while exchanging knowing smiles. Marcus continued outlining the evaluation process before looking across the crowd. His eyes settled briefly on Ethan's worn jacket, then drifted away again. Trevor Mason, one of the larger applicants, leaned toward Ethan with a grin. "You sure you are in the right building?" Ethan answered calmly. "I believe so." Trevor chuckled. "This job is not changing light bulbs." Ethan's expression never changed. "No," he replied quietly. "It is about protecting people." The simple answer briefly silenced Trevor before another applicant laughed again. Marcus clapped his hands once. "Everyone onto the mat. We will begin with controlled evaluations." As the candidates formed a wide circle beneath the bright lights, Lily looked up from her book just long enough to catch her father's eye. She smiled with complete confidence, and Ethan returned the smile before stepping forward without the slightest trace of fear. High above them, Victoria leaned a little closer to the glass. She could not explain why, but for the first time that morning, the only applicant she truly wanted to watch was the one everyone else had already dismissed. 3 days before anyone in the training hall laughed at Ethan Walker, the only sound inside his small apartment was the steady hum of an old coffee maker and the gentle turning of a page from Lily's library book. The alarm clock had never needed to wake him because years of discipline had trained his body to greet each morning before sunrise. At 5:30, the kitchen lights came on, and Ethan quietly began preparing breakfast with the same careful routine he followed every weekday. Fresh scrambled eggs, whole wheat toast, sliced apples, and a small glass of orange juice waited on the table by the time Lily wandered into the kitchen wearing oversized socks and rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Good morning, sweetheart," Ethan said with a warm smile. Lily smiled back. "You beat the alarm again." Ethan laughed softly. "I have been practicing." She climbed into her chair and looked at the lunch container waiting beside her backpack. "Did you put one of your notes inside again?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Maybe." Lily giggled. "I always read them before lunch." He shrugged playfully. "Then I guess I have to keep writing them." Every morning, he slipped a handwritten message into her lunch bag. Sometimes it simply read, "Be kind." Other days it reminded her to stay curious, help someone, or remember that honesty mattered even when nobody was watching. Those tiny notes had become part of their lives after Lily's mother passed away 4 years earlier. Ethan believed encouragement was something a child should receive every day, especially when life had already asked her to grow up too quickly. After breakfast, he drove Lily to school in an aging pickup truck with more than 200,000 miles on the odometer. The heater worked only when it wanted to, and one window made a faint rattling sound every time the truck reached highway speed. But Lily loved that old pickup because every important memory she had with her father seemed to happen inside it. As she climbed out at school, Ethan smiled. "Have a great day." Lily hugged him tightly. "You too, Dad." Ethan watched until she disappeared through the front doors before continuing toward the commercial office complex where he worked as a maintenance technician. His day rarely attracted attention. He repaired loose door handles, replaced damaged ceiling tiles, fixed broken light fixtures, unclogged drains, and carried heavy equipment wherever it needed to go. Most employees knew him only as the quiet man who always arrived before anyone asked for help. Whenever someone thanked him, he answered exactly the same way. "Happy to help." During lunch, he sat alone on a bench outside the building, eating a homemade turkey sandwich while reading a borrowed leadership book from the public library. His supervisor, Frank Donovan, walked over carrying a folded flyer. "You ever think about changing careers?" Frank asked. Ethan smiled politely. "Not lately." Frank handed him the paper anyway. "A company downtown is hiring executive protection specialists. The salary is incredible." Ethan glanced at the advertisement without much interest until his eyes reached the compensation package. It was enough to replace the unreliable truck, pay off the remaining medical bills, and begin saving for Lily's college education. Frank noticed the change in his expression. "You should apply." Ethan folded the flyer carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "It has been a long time." Frank smiled. "Sometimes the best part of who you are is simply waiting for the right reason to come back." That evening, after helping Lily finish her science homework and reading together before bedtime, Ethan quietly looked at the application once more. He did not see prestige, recognition, or a chance to impress anyone. He saw an opportunity to build a better future for the little girl sleeping peacefully down the hallway, and for Ethan Walker, that was always reason enough to take the next step. Back inside Sterling Dynamics headquarters, the training hall gradually settled into an uneasy silence as every applicant gathered around the central evaluation area. Bright overhead lights reflected across the polished floor, and the faint scent of fresh rubber mats mixed with the aroma of coffee drifting in from the executive lounge nearby. Marcus Hale stood confidently in the center of the room with a digital tablet in one hand. Years of training executive protection specialists had taught him to recognize confidence almost instantly, but he also knew that confidence and discipline were rarely the same thing. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "today is not about showing off. We are looking for judgment, awareness, communication, professionalism, and restraint. Anyone can look impressive for 5 minutes. We are searching for someone who can make the right decision when everyone else is making the wrong one." Several applicants nodded while exchanging confident smiles. Trevor Mason stretched his shoulders dramatically before whispering to another candidate. "Sounds like they are describing me already." A few nearby applicants laughed quietly. Ethan Walker remained near the back of the group, listening without speaking. He adjusted the visitor badge clipped to his faded work jacket before briefly looking toward the reception area. Lily had already settled comfortably into a chair, completely absorbed in her library book. She looked up just long enough to wave at her father with a reassuring smile. Ethan smiled back before returning his attention to Marcus. High above the training floor, Victoria Sterling stood behind the observation glass beside Daniel Brooks. She watched every interaction carefully, paying as much attention to how applicants treated one another as to their physical ability. Most interviews begin before candidates realize they have started, she said quietly. Daniel nodded. You are still watching, Mr. Walker. Victoria answered honestly. Everyone else is trying to be noticed. He seems perfectly comfortable letting someone else have the spotlight. Daniel opened Ethan's digital file once more. Maintenance technician for 7 years. Excellent employment history. Community volunteer. Widower. 1 daughter. Everything before that remains restricted. Victoria frowned slightly. Restricted by whom? Daniel shook his head. Federal records. We cannot access them through normal channels. Down below, Marcus continued explaining the evaluation schedule. Observation exercises would come first, followed by communication scenarios, situational awareness assessments, and finally controlled demonstrations with senior instructors. Executive protection is not about winning fights, Marcus reminded everyone. Our responsibility is to prevent problems before they happen. Ethan gave a nearly invisible nod, as though he agreed with every word. Trevor noticed and laughed again. You look like you have done this before. Ethan answered calmly. Everyone has experience doing something. Trevor smirked. You fix broken doors. Ethan smiled politely. Sometimes. And today you think you can protect the most powerful woman in this building. Ethan paused for a brief moment before answering. I think every person deserves to feel safe. The simple response unexpectedly silenced Trevor. Before another joke could begin, Marcus called everyone into formation. Pair off and prepare for the first assessment. The applicants immediately spread across the room. Some bounced lightly on their feet. Others adjusted expensive gloves or exchanged determined looks. Ethan quietly stepped into position without any unnecessary movement. His breathing remained slow and steady. His posture looked relaxed instead of tense. Grant Sullivan, the senior instructor responsible for the final evaluation, watched him from across the room with growing curiosity. There was something strangely familiar about the quiet way Ethan carried himself. Not dramatic, not intimidating, simply balanced. Grant had spent decades studying professional movement, and instincts developed over a lifetime rarely made mistakes. He turned toward Marcus and spoke softly enough that only he could hear. Keep an eye on the man in the work jacket. Marcus glanced across the room. Why? Grant never looked away from Ethan. Because everyone else is watching appearances. He paused thoughtfully before adding. I think we may be looking at the wrong applicant for all the right reasons. Marcus Hale raised one hand, and the quiet murmur inside the training hall disappeared almost instantly. The first 3 evaluations are complete, he announced. Now we move to controlled defensive demonstrations. Remember, this is not a contest. We are measuring awareness, restraint, decision-making, and professionalism. Several applicants rolled their shoulders confidently while tightening the straps on their training gloves. Trevor Mason flashed a grin toward the other candidates. Finally, he said, something that separates the real professionals from the spectators. A few people chuckled. Ethan Walker quietly accepted a pair of standard training gloves from one of the assistants. Thank you, he said with a polite smile. The assistant nodded, noticing that Ethan treated every member of the staff with the same respect he offered everyone else. High above the training floor, Victoria Sterling folded her arms while continuing to observe. Interesting, she said softly. Daniel Brooks looked toward her. What is? Victoria kept watching Ethan. Most applicants become louder as the evaluations become more difficult. He becomes quieter. Daniel glanced down at the digital file still open on his tablet. There is still nothing beyond the restricted records. Victoria answered without looking away. Sometimes silence tells you more than paperwork. Marcus reviewed the next pairing assignments before looking across the room. His eyes settled on Ethan. Mr. Walker. Ethan stepped forward immediately. Yes, sir. Marcus smiled slightly. You will participate in the next demonstration. Trevor laughed loudly enough for the entire room to hear. Well, that should be quick. Another applicant added. At least the janitor gets a front row seat. More laughter echoed through the hall. Ethan simply walked to the center of the training area without reacting. Grant Sullivan stepped onto the mat from the opposite side. Tall, composed, and carrying decades of executive protection experience, Grant extended his hand before anything else. "Grant Sullivan," he said warmly. Ethan accepted the handshake. "Ethan Walker." Grant immediately noticed something unusual. Ethan's handshake contained no unnecessary force, no attempt to dominate, and no hesitation. It was balanced, relaxed, and remarkably steady. Grant released his hand slowly, studying Ethan for another moment before taking his position. Marcus addressed everyone watching. "This is a controlled professional assessment. Respect your fellow participants. We are evaluating discipline, not aggression." The surrounding applicants formed a wide circle around the mat. Lily quietly closed her library book and watched her father with complete confidence, her small hands folded calmly in her lap. She did not appear nervous. She simply believed in him. Grant settled into a comfortable stance and smiled politely. "Ready?" Ethan nodded once. "Whenever you are." Marcus lowered his hand. "Begin." Grant moved first, not with speed intended to overwhelm, but with careful precision designed to evaluate balance, posture, and awareness. Ethan responded with one small adjustment of his feet, remaining perfectly centered. Grant paused for the briefest moment. The movement had been so efficient that many observers barely noticed it, yet Grant had spent an entire career recognizing details others missed. He changed direction smoothly, testing Ethan from another angle. Again, Ethan answered with calm economy, using almost no visible effort while maintaining complete control of his balance. The laughter around the room began to disappear. Trevor slowly uncrossed his arms. Marcus narrowed his eyes with growing curiosity. Victoria leaned slightly closer to the observation glass. Grant increased the complexity of the exercise one final time, only to discover that Ethan calmly anticipated every adjustment without displaying tension or urgency. After several quiet seconds, Grant stepped back on his own and lowered his hands. He looked directly at Ethan before smiling with unmistakable respect. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I have seen everything I needed to see." A silence unlike anything earlier that morning settled across the entire training hall, and for the first time since Ethan Walker had entered the building, nobody could find a reason to laugh. The silence lingered so long that even the quiet hum of the ventilation system suddenly seemed louder than the voices that had filled the room only moments earlier. Grant Sullivan lowered his hands completely and took one slow step forward. His expression no longer carried the confidence of an instructor evaluating another applicant. Instead, it reflected the unmistakable respect of one professional recognizing another. "Mr. Walker," he said calmly, "where did you learn to move like that?" Ethan removed the training gloves without any sense of accomplishment on his face. "A long time ago," he answered quietly. Grant smiled faintly. "I thought so." Marcus Hale looked from Grant to Ethan with visible confusion. During more than 15 years of leading executive protection evaluations, he had never seen Grant end an assessment early. "Grant," Marcus asked carefully, "are you saying the evaluation is complete?" Grant nodded. "Completely." Marcus frowned. "You only observed him for a few moments." Grant folded his arms and looked around the room before answering loudly enough for every applicant to hear. "Sometimes a few moments tell you everything. Confidence can be practiced. Strength can be built. Technique can be improved. Judgment, patience, and discipline take a lifetime." Nobody interrupted him. Trevor Mason stared quietly at the floor, replaying every joke he had made that morning. Victoria Sterling remained motionless behind the observation glass, her attention fixed entirely on Ethan Walker. Daniel Brooks looked down at his tablet one more time. "I still cannot access his earlier records," he said. "Everything before 7 years ago remains restricted." Victoria answered without hesitation. "Find someone who can." Minutes later, while the remaining applicants continued their scheduled evaluations, Grant quietly stepped into a nearby hallway and removed his phone from his jacket pocket. He hesitated only briefly before scrolling to a number he had not called in nearly 4 years. The phone rang twice before an older voice answered. "James Whitmore." Grant smiled politely. "Colonel, this is Grant Sullivan." "Grant," the retired officer replied warmly. "It has been a while. What can I do for you?" Grant looked back through the glass window toward the training hall, where Ethan was once again kneeling beside Lily, listening carefully as she excitedly described the ending of her library book. "I need to ask you about someone," Grant said. His name is Ethan Walker. The line became completely silent. Grant checked the phone for a moment to make sure the connection had not dropped. Finally, the colonel spoke again, but this time his voice sounded lower and far more deliberate. Did you say Ethan Walker? Yes, sir. Another pause followed. Where is he? Grant answered truthfully. At an executive protection evaluation in Columbus. The colonel exhaled slowly. Then listened carefully. Grant instinctively straightened his posture, although nobody could see him. Yes, sir. Do not ask him about his past unless he chooses to tell you himself. If that truly is Ethan Walker, you are standing in the same room as one of the finest instructors I have ever known. Some people measure a man by medals. I measure him by the lives he quietly prepared to protect others. Ethan never cared about recognition. He cared that everyone went home safely. Grant remained silent. Sir, he finally asked, why did he disappear? The colonel's answer came gently. Because sometimes the greatest act of service is not staying where people admire you. Sometimes it is going home to raise the child who needs you most. The call ended, leaving Grant standing alone in the quiet hallway. Through the glass, he watched Ethan laugh softly as Lily proudly showed him a simple drawing she had finished while waiting. In that ordinary father and daughter moment, Grant suddenly understood something no military file could ever explain. Ethan Walker had never walked away from greatness. He had simply chosen a different way to live it. Grant Sullivan returned to the training hall, carrying far more than a completed phone call. He carried certainty. For the first time since the evaluations had begun, his attention was no longer focused on selecting the strongest applicant. It was focused on understanding the quiet man who had somehow become the center of every conversation without ever asking for attention. Marcus Hale met him near the edge of the training floor. Well, he asked quietly. Grant looked across the room toward Ethan, who was helping Lily place her finished drawing carefully back inside her backpack before thanking one of the reception staff for lending her colored pencils. The colonel confirmed it, Grant replied. Marcus lowered his voice. Who is he? Grant smiled faintly. Someone who never wanted people talking about who he used to be. Before Marcus could ask another question, a soft alert sounded through the building. It was not an emergency alarm, only a security notification sent to management. Daniel Brooks immediately glanced at the message displayed on his tablet. Victoria, he said calmly through his headset. Security has reported an unusual situation at the executive loading entrance. A delivery vehicle has arrived with identification that does not match today's schedule. Victoria remained composed behind the observation glass. Has anyone spoken with the driver? Daniel answered, not yet. They are verifying credentials first. Ethan happened to overhear only a portion of the conversation while waiting beside Lily. He did not interrupt. He simply watched the expressions of the security staff for a brief moment before quietly speaking to Marcus. May I offer one suggestion? Marcus nodded immediately. Of course. Ethan smiled politely. Before assuming bad intentions, ask someone to speak directly with the driver. Mistakes happen more often than people expect. Marcus relayed the suggestion through his radio without mentioning where it had come from. Less than 2 minutes later, another update arrived. A shipping coordinator from a neighboring office complex had accidentally exchanged access badges with the delivery driver during a morning equipment transfer. The identification mismatch was nothing more than a paperwork mistake. Daniel looked toward Victoria with visible relief. Situation resolved. Victoria slowly turned toward Ethan below. The entire issue had ended peacefully because someone had recommended understanding before suspicion. That observation stayed with her. Down on the training floor, Trevor Mason approached Ethan with noticeably different body language than earlier that morning. Can I ask you something? He said. Ethan nodded. Sure. Trevor hesitated. When everyone was laughing at you, why did you never answer back? Ethan looked toward Lily for a moment before speaking. Children learn more from what we do than from what we say. My daughter was watching. That was enough reason to choose my words carefully. Trevor lowered his eyes. I never thought about it like that. Ethan smiled warmly. Most of us are still learning. Nearby, several applicants who had once joked about Ethan quietly listened without saying a word. The atmosphere inside the building had changed completely. Earlier that morning, people had competed to appear impressive. Now they seemed more interested in becoming better versions of themselves. Victoria finally left the observation balcony and walked onto the training floor for the first time that day. The conversations naturally faded as she approached Ethan. Mr. Walker, she said with genuine respect. Would you and Lily join me for a private conversation after today's evaluations are complete? Ethan looked briefly toward his daughter, who answered with a small, encouraging smile before returning to her book. He looked back at Victoria and nodded. We would be happy to. Victoria returned the smile, but as she walked away, she realized she was no longer interviewing a candidate simply because he had performed well. She wanted to understand how one quiet father had managed to change the atmosphere of an entire room without raising his voice, without demanding recognition, and without forgetting kindness even for a single moment. Late that afternoon, when the final evaluation officially ended, most of the applicants quietly gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, but Ethan Walker remained where he was, helping Lily zip her backpack before thanking every member of the reception staff who had looked after her throughout the day. She carefully placed the borrowed coloring pencils back into their container one by one instead of simply setting them on the desk. The receptionist smiled warmly. You did not have to do that. Lily looked toward her father before answering. Dad says people notice how you leave a place long after they forget when you arrived. Ethan smiled but said nothing. Victoria Sterling had been standing only a few feet away when she heard those words. She glanced toward Daniel Brooks, who quietly closed the folder containing the day's evaluation reports. Please prepare conference room 3, she said. No board members. No legal team. Just the 4 of us. A few minutes later, Ethan and Lily stepped into a quiet executive conference room overlooking the Columbus skyline. Warm afternoon sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, filling the room with soft golden light that reflected across the polished wooden table. Victoria greeted them personally instead of waiting behind the table. Thank you both for coming. Lily smiled politely. Thank you for inviting us. Daniel quietly placed coffee in front of Ethan, orange juice in front of Lily, and tea beside Victoria before excusing himself to wait outside the room. For a few moments, no one spoke. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Finally, Victoria looked directly at Ethan. I have interviewed hundreds of people during my career, she began. Many arrived determined to convince me they were exceptional. You spent the entire day trying to convince no one of anything. Ethan smiled softly. That was never why I came. Victoria leaned forward slightly. Then why did you? Ethan glanced toward Lily, who was quietly reading another library book while occasionally sipping her orange juice. Because every parent hopes to leave their child a better future than the one they inherited. Victoria followed his eyes toward Lily before looking back. Colonel Whitmore spoke very highly of you. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. He has always been generous. Victoria smiled. He also refused to tell me what you actually did. Ethan laughed quietly for the first time that day. That sounds like him. Victoria waited, hoping he might continue, but he simply folded his hands together on the table. You really do not enjoy talking about yourself, do you? Ethan answered honestly. Most of the people who mattered already know who I was. The only person who needs to know who I am now is sitting beside me. Lily looked up from her book and smiled without fully understanding the conversation, but she understood the way her father looked at her. Victoria noticed that expression immediately. It carried neither pride nor sadness. It carried purpose. She slowly closed Ethan's application folder. May I ask you one final question? Ethan nodded. Of course. Victoria spoke quietly. If you receive this position, what would success look like to you? Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked through the window toward the busy streets far below where thousands of ordinary people continued living completely unaware of the conversation taking place high above them. Success, he finally said, would mean that everyone goes home safely at the end of the day, and my daughter still believes kindness is stronger than pride. Victoria remained silent for several long seconds. In all her years leading one of the largest technology companies in America, she had never heard anyone describe executive protection that way. It was not about reputation, prestige, authority, or recognition. It was about responsibility. And as the quiet afternoon light settled across the conference room, Victoria realized that the greatest qualification Ethan Walker possessed could never be listed on any resume because it had been written instead in every ordinary choice he made when he believed no one important was watching. When Ethan and Lily finally left the conference room, the evening sun had already begun to paint long golden reflections across the glass walls of Sterling Dynamics headquarters. The building itself seemed quieter than it had that morning, not because fewer people remained inside, but because something had changed in the hearts of those who had witnessed the day's events. Daniel Brooks stood waiting outside the conference room, holding a sealed folder. "Victoria," he said softly, "the hiring committee has finished reviewing every evaluation." She accepted the folder without opening it immediately. "I already know what it says," she replied with a faint smile. Daniel looked at her curiously. "Then why read it?" Victoria glanced toward Ethan, who was helping Lily slip her backpack onto her shoulders before thanking the administrative assistant for her kindness. Because good decisions should still follow good process. A few minutes later, the final applicants were invited back into the training hall. The atmosphere could not have been more different from the one that greeted Ethan that morning. Earlier, there had been laughter, whispered jokes, and confident predictions. Now there was quiet anticipation. Marcus Hale stepped forward holding a clipboard. "Before today's final announcement," he began, "I want to say something that has nothing to do with scores." He paused, allowing the silence to settle naturally. Professionalism is not measured by how impressive someone appears during success. It is measured by how they treat people before they know who they are standing beside. Several applicants lowered their eyes. Trevor Mason slowly took one step forward. "Mr. Walker," he said sincerely, "I owe you an apology." Ethan turned toward him with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the day. Trevor continued, "I judged your jacket before I ever listened to your words. I assumed your job described your value. I was wrong." Ethan smiled gently. "Thank you for saying that." Trevor looked surprised. "You are not upset?" Ethan shook his head. People grow by recognizing mistakes, not by pretending they never made them. Another applicant stepped forward, followed by another, each offering quiet words of respect rather than excuses. Ethan accepted every apology exactly the same way, without triumph, without resentment, and without reminding anyone how poorly they had treated him only hours earlier. From across the room, Grant Sullivan watched with quiet satisfaction. "Colonel Whitmore was right," he whispered to Marcus. "He teaches long before he ever starts talking." Victoria stepped onto the training floor carrying the sealed folder. Every conversation stopped. She looked around the room before speaking. "Today I witnessed remarkable skill, impressive discipline, and genuine professionalism." She paused before continuing. "But I also witnessed something far more valuable. I witnessed humility under pressure, patience in the face of disrespect, and kindness offered without expecting anything in return." She turned toward Ethan. "Mr. Walker, I would like to thank you." Ethan nodded politely. "Thank you for the opportunity." Victoria smiled. "No. Thank you for reminding all of us that leadership begins long before someone receives authority." Lily quietly reached for her father's hand, looking up at him with unmistakable pride. Ethan gently squeezed her hand before looking back toward Victoria. Around them, the training hall remained completely silent. Not the uncomfortable silence that follows embarrassment, but the peaceful silence that comes when an entire room realizes it has just learned something worth remembering. And in that quiet moment, every expensive resume, every polished introduction, and every confident first impression seemed far less important than the simple example of one father who had spent the entire day proving that dignity never needs to raise its voice to be heard. The following morning, the first rays of sunlight stretched across the glass walls of Sterling Dynamics headquarters as employees arrived carrying coffee cups, laptops, and the quiet determination that comes with a new workday. Ethan Walker parked his aging pickup truck in the visitor lot just before 8 o'clock. The truck looked out of place beside the rows of luxury vehicles. Yet Ethan stepped out with the same calm confidence he had shown the day before. Lily climbed down beside him, adjusting her backpack before smiling up at her father. "Ready?" she asked. Ethan smiled warmly. "Always." They walked together through the front entrance where the receptionist immediately recognized them. "Good morning, Mr. Walker." "Good morning, Lily." Lily smiled politely. "Good morning." Around the lobby, several employees who had watched the previous day's evaluations quietly nodded with genuine respect. There were no whispers now, no amused smiles, and no careless assumptions. Only simple courtesy. Victoria Sterling was already waiting near the executive elevators instead of inside her office. She stepped forward with a welcoming smile and extended her hand. "Good morning, Mr. Walker." Ethan accepted the handshake. "Good morning." Victoria looked toward Lily. "And good morning to our favorite reader." Lily laughed softly while holding up the library book she had brought with her. I started another one. I expected nothing less, Victoria replied. Together, they entered a private conference room where Daniel Brooks placed a single envelope on the polished wooden table. Our hiring committee completed every review, Victoria said. Every evaluation, every recommendation, every interview, and every reference led to exactly the same conclusion. Ethan quietly opened the envelope and carefully read each page. The offer appointed him Senior Executive Protection Specialist for Sterling Dynamics, with comprehensive health coverage, flexible scheduling whenever family responsibilities required it, professional development opportunities, and an education assistance program that would help secure Lily's future. Ethan looked up thoughtfully. This is incredibly generous. Victoria shook her head gently. No, it reflects the responsibility we are asking you to accept and the character we believe you will bring to everyone around you. Ethan folded the offer neatly before speaking. I accept. Lily's face brightened with quiet joy, and she reached over to hug her father. Congratulations, Dad. Ethan hugged her back with a smile that carried both gratitude and relief. As they stepped back into the main lobby, Marcus Hale, Grant Sullivan, Trevor Mason, and several employees were waiting nearby. Trevor extended his hand once more. I hope someday I earn the kind of respect you earned yesterday. Ethan smiled kindly. Respect is built one decision at a time. You already started yesterday. Grant nodded with quiet admiration. The Colonel was right about you. Ethan smiled modestly. He has always been kinder than I deserve. Victoria looked around the lobby before addressing everyone present. Yesterday reminded us that leadership is not something people announce. It is something they practice when nobody expects recognition. The room remained peacefully silent. There was no dramatic applause, no celebration, and no grand speeches. There was only a shared understanding that everyone had witnessed something rare. As Ethan and Lily walked toward the executive offices together, he was still wearing the same faded work jacket he had worn to the interview. Victoria noticed it immediately and smiled. You decided to keep the jacket. Ethan glanced down at it with quiet affection. It reminds me where I came from. Victoria nodded. Then I hope you never replace it. Ethan smiled, and together they continued down the hallway toward a future neither of them could have imagined only a few days earlier. Some people would remember the evaluations. Others would remember the interview. But those who were there would remember something far more lasting. They would remember the quiet father who never argued, never boasted, never demanded respect, yet somehow inspired an entire building to become a little kinder, a little humbler, and a little wiser simply by living with dignity every ordinary day.